In the early morning hours of February 4th, 1893, West Market Street in Indianapolis, Indiana, was quiet. Tucked between Circle Park, which is now known as Monument Circle, and the Indiana State House, the normally busy avenue had yet to come to life. Still covered in darkness from the previous night and dusted with snow from a recent storm, activity on the street was minimal on this bitterly cold Saturday morning. Except for the light whistle of the wind, West Market Street was quiet this morning.
That is, until the sound of 3 muffled gunshots struggled to escape the walls of the house that once stood here at what was 172 West Market Street.
The one-story wooden house at 172 West Market Street spent most of its previous 20 years leading up to this morning as a boarding house, but city officials and local police officers knew this building as something else. Italian immigrants used the word bagnio to describe the building, and for good reason. The little house on West Market Street, which mostly rented out rooms to attractive young women, was now known as a brothel. And on this cold winter morning, inside one of those rooms, 2 people are lying on the floor, covered in blood, and fighting for their lives. The brothel stood on the city block straddling West Market Street to the north and West Court Street to the south. And if you turned down the alley on Court Street, opened the small wooden gate, walked up the path, and opened the side door, you'd find yourself in the room of 25-year-old Elizabeth Bessie Pittman, also known as Bessie Bell. Owned by a local woman named Bertha Brunner, it is unclear how many women were living and working in the brothel at this time. While several brothel control laws had been enacted in Indiana in 1891, there remained an uneasy truce between the Indianapolis police and area brothels, with enforcement of the brothel control laws being inconsistent at best. But to the dismay of the residents at 172 West Market Street, their brothel was about to become the unwelcome scene of much attention from local police. Because inside of the room of Bessie Bell, lying on the blood-stained floor next to her bed, was her boyfriend of 2 years, Phil Fahrbach. Fahrbach was a 24-year-old bartender at the nearby English Hotel. Fahrbach was well known to the other inmates of the Burner brothel. They told stories of the 2 young lovers and how their fights would often spill onto the streets after long nights of drinking. Once, after a heated argument inside a saloon, Phil began to choke Bessie. She escaped by biting the tip of one of his fingers off. Another incident, in October of 1892, Bessie grabbed her gun and shot at Phil as he was lying asleep in her bed. The bullet passed over Fahrbach's head and lodged itself into the wall. But on the February morning of 1893, as Phil Fahrbach now lay on the floor of Bessie Bell's room, powder burns to his face and a bullet in his skull, there seemed to be much more to the story than a lover's quarrel turned bad. Because alongside Phil, also laying in a pool of blood, with a bullet hole in her head, was Bessie Bell. Exactly what happened that morning inside Bessie's room was not immediately known by investigators, partially because other residents in the house were reluctant to give testimony. Marion County Coroner William Beck had the other women in the house subpoenaed by a court to obtain their accounts of the incident. And even then, when interviewed by the coroner, the women of the house gave reluctant, timid, and sometimes inconsistent testimony. According to the women, Bessie was last seen at 2 a.m. heading to bed alone. But one key witness was able to provide a first-hand account of what happened that morning on West Market Street. Despite losing a massive amount of blood and sight in her right eye, Bessie Bell, having been stabilized by a doctor, was well enough to speak.
Bessie said Phil arrived at her door, which would have been right around here in the alleyway between Market Street and Court Street between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m.
Having finished his shift at the English Hotel bar many hours before, Bessie asked Phil where he had been all night. Bessie said Phil was drunk. After accusing Bessie of sleeping with other men, Bessie said Phil walked across the room, grabbed her gun off the dresser, and fired 3 shots. According to her testimony, the first bullet went into the wall, the second into her face, striking her right cheek just below her temple. And for the third, Phil Fahrbach turned the gun toward his own head. Hearing the gunshots, other brothel residents charged into Bessie's room. One made her way to Phil, who was lying on the floor, the blood in his head emptying itself onto the carpet. For a moment, she said Phil's lips were moving, but no sound came from them. Seconds later, he died. Almost immediately, women in the house ran out into Market Street, and a few went to go fetch Bessie's mother, Martha Kinsey, also known as Meddy Bell. She lived just a few blocks away. At the same time, an overnight guest at the brothel named James Lenahan also ran out of the house, anxiously looking to make a quick getaway from the scene. James said he heard the gunshots that morning, but he initially thought it was the sound of the cook chopping wood to start the fire for the morning breakfast. A few seconds later, James says, Bessie came stumbling into the room he was occupying with a fellow brothel inmate, blood streaming down her head, and she thrust herself onto the bed crying. Startled, James quickly dressed himself and ran out of the house. Perhaps embarrassed about being caught in such a situation, Lenahan ignored requests from the coroner for 3 days to testify about what he saw that morning. Eventually, he did testify that when he left the house via a side door, he ran to Cohn's overall factory to call for help. The police, Coroner Beck, and a local doctor named Samuel Earp all arrived at the same time. As Dr. Earp began to stabilize and bandage up the wounds of Bessie Bell, Coroner Beck started to examine the crime scene and the body of Phil Fahrbach. After some time, he came to a startling conclusion. Phil Fahrbach may have not died by suicide. Back at his office with Phil's body, Coroner Beck noticed no damage to Fahrbach's eyelid. He theorized that if someone were to shoot themselves in the eye, their natural reflexes would close that eye when pulling the trigger. But Fahrbach's eyelid was undamaged, leading Coroner Beck to believe that Phil's eye was open at the time of impact. In addition to a lack of powder burn on Fahrbach's face and hands, Coroner Beck found that the bullet he pulled from Fahrbach's skull was a different caliber than the one that should have come from Bessie Pittman's revolver, the one Phil used for the shooting. While an unused cartridge from her gun was taken and weighed at 32 grams, the bullet inside Fahrbach's skull weighed 6 to 8 grams more. These circumstances led Coroner Beck to make an initial determination that the death of Phil Fahrbach was a homicide. When Coroner Beck questioned brothel owner Bertha Bruner about these circumstances, she did mention that it was possible there may have been another man in the room with Bessie and Phil early that morning. His name was Thomas Fosner, a man that she believed was a riverboat captain from Cincinnati, and he was a former lover of Bessie Bell. Bessie's mother, Maddie, said Phil often abused Bessie out of jealousy for her past relationship with Fosner. And while Bertha Bruner said she had not seen Fosner with Bessie in some time, others in the neighborhood revealed that he had been around the area recently, and some said they had seen him in the company of Bessie. A nearby saloon keeper said he saw Fosner in the city just the day before at his saloon, and he saw him again near the brothel. Ultimately, after much searching, Coroner Beck was unable to locate Tom Fosner and question him.
One of the first things investigators noticed when examining the crime scene was the trail of blood in the snow. It started down at Bessie's side door and continued down the alleyway all the way to Court Street before trailing off.
But police concluded that the blood more than likely came from the clothing of James Lenahan as he ran away from the scene to call for help. To add to the confusion, a neighbor who lived across the street from the brothel told investigators that he heard 4 shots that morning. When inspecting the room again later that day, police found 2 mysterious bullet holes, one in the wall and one in the ceiling. And as if additional bullet holes, random trails of blood, and mysterious out-of-town lovers weren't enough to contend with for investigators, tips, most of them false, began to flow into the police department from Indianapolis residents and some pranksters. In the days and weeks after the shooting, Bessie Bell slowly recovered from her wound. It is not known if she ever regained sight in her right eye, or if the bullet was ever freed from her skull. At one point, it was asked if Bessie herself may have been the one who shot Phil Fahrbach, but a lack of gunpowder on her hands and face quickly ruled that out as a possibility. With all their leads drying up and a lack of evidence, police investigators finally ruled Phil Fahrbach's death suicide by gunshot. In the following years, Bessie would go on to marry a man named Louis Ruse. But after he died of Bright's disease in August of 1903, Bessie descended into grief and was committed to a hospital. After 2 weeks of refusing to eat, a heartbroken Bessie Bell died on January 5th, 1904.
But with the brothel residents unwilling to tell the full story and Bessie Pittman not changing her side of the story, police investigators just grew tired of searching for the truth. They saw what happened here at 172 West Market Street as just another brothel love story gone wrong. For Circle City Talk, I'm Chris Wakefield.